So, good afternoon, and I'm pleased to welcome Professor Jeffrey Herf back to Tel Aviv University. I'm saying back to Tel Aviv University because Jeffrey has many good friends at this university and actually in all other universities in Israel. And his studies are much appreciated in the academic arena worldwide. But Jeffrey is not only a renowned scholar, he is also a publicist writing about current political issues based on his wide historical knowledge and deep insights. And even before October 7, but particularly since then, Jeffrey has published and has been much involved in debates over what he believes to be misperception and even intended distortion of reality in the Middle East, particularly following the Hamas attack on Israel. He stands firmly against anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and anti-Israel, and there are many things to say about his long and successful academic career, and I will just briefly note a few main points. So Professor Jeffrey Herf is a distinguished university professor emeritus in the Department of History, University of Maryland, College Park. He's published extensively on modern German history and on the impact and the after effects of Nazism on the Middle East. His publications include Nazi propaganda for the Arab world and the undeclared wars with Israel, East Germany, and the West German far left from 1967 to 1989. In 2022, Cambridge University Press published his Israel's Moment, International Support and Opposition for the Establishing the Jewish State, 1945-1949. His essay collection, Three Faces of Anti-Semitism, Right, Left, and Islamist, was published by Routledge in January 2024. Jeffrey, please.
Thank you, Ronnie. We've known each other now for some time. It's been a great pleasure to be your colleague and to be here with Martin Kramer and Meyer Litvak. And my wife and I I'm coming here to express my condolences and also my solidarity. My wife and I just saw the very moving video and musical video of October 7th in the museum. And people talk about difficulties that American Jews have had, difficulties of anti-Semitism in the universities. What we have endured is nothing compared to what you have endured. And your courage is very inspiring. So let's get down to it. We cannot know if after Hamas issued its founding charter in 1988, it could have been stopped from gaining adherents, seizing power in 2007, and launching its attacks on Israel, culminating in the barbarism of October 7th. However, what we do know is that outside Israel, neither the governments in the democracies nor the editors of the prestige press, the New York Times, the Washington Post, London Times, others, and major electronic media in Europe and the United States, none of them did anything substantial to publicize and examine the context of that evil 1988 text. Despite its translation of ideology into suicide bombs in the 1990s and establishment of a small dictatorship in Gaza, Hamas did not receive the condemnation it deserved in American universities and British universities, French universities, and among the graduates who entered government, journalism, and politics. Instead, a set of ideas which in the late 1960s and 1970s had been the preserve of the radical left around the world, gradually filtered into parts of the tenured faculty in our universities. And they are the ideas that justified the terrorism of the Palestine Liberation Organization, which declared Zionism to be a form of racism, Israel to be an apartheid state, and criticism of Islamist Jew hatred to be a form of a new racism called Islamophobia. The illusion of the epoch that we have endured was that any group, however reactionary, which sought to destroy the state of Israel by force of arms, should be counted among the progressive forces of the global left. The half-century of political habits of lies about the nature of Israel and the justification of terror in the name of secular leftism paved the way for the absurdity of incorporating a reactionary phenomenon such as Hamas into the chorus of the global left. In the United States, advocates of Black Power in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Black Panther Party, and the SDS Weathermen faction of the late 60s and early 70s served as vanguards in this shift of the left against Israel. In the Soviet bloc and in the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, the communist regimes redefined anti-fascism to mean support for the war against Israel, the new fascists. At the United Nations, the Soviet ambassador compared Israel's preemptive attack in the Six-Day War to that of the Nazi blitzkrieg of June 1941 and the invasion of the Soviet Union. And the East German propaganda followed suit with charges in the 70s now of genocide and mass murder. In 1972, in response to the Black September murder of Israeli athletes in the Munich Olympics, Ulrike Meinhof of the Red Army faction in West Germany celebrated what she called this action as simultaneously anti-imperialist, anti-fascist, and a great blow against what she called Israeli Nazi fascism. Meinhof was echoing the redefinition of anti-fascism in the West German left of those years. And now it came to supporting the PLO and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine terrorist war against Israel. By September of 2001, the ideas of Meinhof, the Red Army faction, and the West German revolutionary cells had migrated into the institutions of the United Nations, evident most dramatically not only in the 1975 Zionism is Racism resolution, but in the infamous now conference in Durban, South Africa, in early September, a week before the attacks of 9/11, entitled absurdly, the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance. And as you know, the gathering became a festival of anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic hatred. Those decades of the 1960s to the 1980s created a global left that was soft on terrorism, especially if the terror was aimed at this country. As Hamas was waging terror against Israel, then it too, by magic of these political binaries that saw the world in a Manichaean battle between imperialism and anti-imperialism, this magic turned this reactionary organization into a member in good standing of the struggle of the just and the good against the world's oppressors. One result of this illusion was a second era of what we historians of the Nazi era call the problem of underestimation. The phrase is one of the most famous that emerged from the historical scholarship on Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. It refers to the failure of far too many people, including communists, socialists, liberals, and conservatives, to realize that Hitler and his associates were deadly serious about intending to murder the Jews of Europe. The then West German historian Karl Bracher, in his now classic studies, The German Dictatorship, stressed the political blunders of German conservative elites in the 1970s. The British and French advocates of appeasement in the 30s thought satisfying Hitler's territorial demands would lead to peace. In 1939, Stalin thought Hitler was a tool of the capitalists, whose primary enemy was the Soviet Union and the German proletariat. Franz Neumann, director of the Office of Research and Analysis, a German refugee, in the Office of Strategic Services in Washington, D.C., opined in 1942 that the Nazis would never murder the Jews because German capitalists required their preservation for use as a scapegoat to deflect frustrations against the contradictions of capitalism. The British historian Ian Kershaw reminds us that no small amount of agreement and perceived self-interest, not underestimation, contributed to Hitler's support in the German political and economic elites, and that his hatred of the Jews was not at all underestimated by his most ardent supporters. Yet there were some who took Hitler's intentions with the seriousness they deserved, and they were a minority. They included Jabotinsky and Ben-Gurion, the members of the American Zionist Emergency Council, the Jewish diarists in Europe, such as Emanuel Ringelblum, examined by Saul Friedlander. They included Charles Dwork, a dissenting staff member of the Office of Strategic Services. After the Holocaust, these historians became known as a euphemism, the intentionalists, and they emerged, a group who emerged as seeing the Holocaust as clear proof of an infamous unity of theory and practice, ideology and policy. And these historians and observers ranged from the left to the right. They included Hannah Arendt and Lucy Davidovich, Yehuda Bauer and Karl Bracher, Saul Friedlander and Walter Lacour, George Mossy and Fritz Stern, and my generation of Robert Wistrich, Stephen Aschheim, Richard Breitman, Dan Diener, Anson Robbenbach. And then there are others. Whether dissenting from Machiavelli, Hobbes, Adam Smith, Marx, or Lenin, what we all had in common was a conviction that at least in this case, and probably in many others, real realism meant that political decisions were not always the result of economic and political interests, and thus were rational in that sense. This rationalist bias was incapable of grasping the ideological extremes of the 20th century, or perhaps even the centuries-long belief in religion, or in religious convictions about the Jews. Resistance within the historical profession to we intentionalists was considerable. But over time, the weight of the evidence of the connection between word and deed, ideology and policy won the day, at least for several decades. Simply put, without radical Jew hatred at the top levels of the Nazi regime, there would have been no final solution. And without centuries of Jew hatred in Europe, there would not have been thousands of collaborators and supporters. Together with the government statements from the Islamic Republic of Iran following 1979, the Hamas Charter of 1988, these have the same significance for the history of anti-Semitism that Mein Kampf and Hitler's prophecy speech of January 30th of 1939, Goebbels' famous essays on the Jews and the war, they have that same causal significance. In prose that was crystal clear and available on the internet in English translation by 2008, the Islamic resistance movement in Gaza proudly announced its intention to wage a war against the Jews in the name of its interpretation of Islam with the purpose of destroying this country. Hamas was not and is not a carbon copy of Nazism. The cultural references, the religious background, the ideological heroes are different. Yet long before the massacre of October 7th, 2023, Hamas had proudly declared its evil intentions and did so confidently. Yet despite the seemingly widely understood reality of the connection between anti-Semitic ideology and intention to murder Jews during the Holocaust, a second era of underestimation has taken place in the historical profession in my country and in Europe. And that underestimation took place in governments, in human rights organizations, at the United Nations, and among self-identified leftists who combined underestimation with, as we know from October 7th and October 8th, apologia and even justification. By 2014, as I wrote in the pages of the American Interest magazine, underestimation had given way to support. A pro-Hamas left had emerged in American universities, echoing the propaganda of Hamas, denouncing Israel, and supporting the boycott initiatives. Judith Butler, a professor of literature at the University of California, who for reasons I am at a loss to understand has had an influence on academics regarding Israel-related issues, declared Hamas to be part of the global progressive left, and many American feminists seem to agree with her. Scholars of Latin America in the United States and in Latin America were prominent in the emergence of an objectively and then subjectively pro-Hamas left that was also appearing in Britain and in Europe. As a historian of Nazism, I concluded that the emergence of apologia, excuses, and underestimation of Hamas indicated that much of the scholarly and intellectual world had never really understood the radical anti-Semitism in Europe, its causal centrality in the Holocaust, or if they did understand it, they suffered from a severe failure of comparative historical imagination, as if Jew hatred really only happened long ago and in Germany. This is a massive scholarly failure. As you know, in the aftermath of the mass murders, there were open letters and signed statements in prestigious and not so prestigious universities, placing the attacks of that day into a distinct, quote, historical context, unquote. And that historical context that my colleagues at the University of Maryland and elsewhere discovered was 75 years of Israeli occupation, dispossession, and repression of the Palestinians, as articulated by the Columbia University professor Rashid Khalidi. It offered a scholarly gloss to a justification by arguing that once again the Jews, and rather the Zionists, were guilty and essentially got what they deserved. In the universities, in the press, and the famous human rights organizations, one heard less about another historical context that I want to talk about today. It's the context of the core ideological beliefs of Hamas and of the now almost 90-year history of Islamism, one that began in the 1930s, that gained global attention when the Islamists collaborated with Nazi Germany during World War II and the Holocaust. The Islamists, in the person of Hajj Amin al-Husseini and the Muslim Brothers and the Arab Higher Committee, were crucial to the Arab decision to reject the UN resolution of 1947, one of the greatest political blunders of the 20th century. As you all know, if the partition resolution had been accepted, there would have been two states living side by side long ago. It was the Muslim Brothers and Husseini that began the civil war of 1947 and urged the Arab states to invade in 1948, and since then have rejected every compromise offer made by successive Israeli governments. In its charter or covenant of 1988, Hamas expressed this blend of Jew hatred and modern conspiracy theories of Nazism. Its terrorist attacks of the 90s, its seizure of power in Gaza, the establishment of the dictatorship, the transformation of Gaza into a fortress and its underground tunnels, the murders of October 7th, these were all, this historian of Nazism has written, and it's obvious, these were all the translations of its core beliefs into policy and action. I assume that much of this history is familiar to many, if not most of you. I'm telling you things many of you already know. But the following is perhaps a little bit less known, and it is certainly less known to the vast majority of my fellow American academics, including those who opine a great deal about the Middle East, or certainly, and even more so, to the mass publics in the United States and in Europe. And so today I want to talk about some key texts that may be familiar to all of you about the tradition of Islamist hatred of Jews and therefore of Israel. The canonical text of the Palestinian dimension of the Islamist tradition, again, is one that may be familiar to all of you. It was first articulated in September of 1937 by the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, who was then a man on the run because the British wanted to arrest him after his role in the riots and violence of 1936-39. And because he was a man on the run, he couldn't deliver the speech in person at a meeting in Blue Dawn, Syria of pan-Arabist activists. And he wrote a text called Islam and the Jews, Islam and the Jews. And it is, I think, the or one of the canonical texts of the Islamist tradition. Martin Kramer and Meyer Litvak here are scholars to whom we are enormously indebted, and they know much more about this field than I do. But there is a famous mantra now for cultural and intellectual historians, and it's called the labor of selective tradition. The labor of selective tradition. And it makes a simple point, and that is that what some intellectuals and political figures do is they take large traditions and they interpret them selectively in particular ways. And in so doing, what Husseini did in 1937 was to say that there's the religion of Islam, and it has had an ambivalent relationship to the Jews. And you can read the Quran and you can find some nice things about the Jews, and you can read the Quran and find some nasty things about the Jews. And like any of these ancient traditions, there are ideas that in modern times seem absurd and ridiculous, and others not less so. But he is interpreting the tradition to mean the battle between the Jews and Islam began when Muhammad fled from Mecca to Medina. In those days, the Jewish methods were exactly the same as they are today. Then as now, slander was their weapon. They said Muhammad was a swindler. They tried to undermine his honor. Just as the Jews were able to betray Muhammad, so they will betray the Muslims today. The verses of the Quran and the Hadith assert that the Jews were Islam's most bitter enemy and moreover try to destroy it. Husseini in 1937 argued that the Zionist project was only the most recent of 7 centuries of Jewish attacks on the religion of Islam. And therefore, the effort to prevent the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine was, in his view, a religious obligation of all Muslims. Now, because there is so much controversy and confusion about this issue, I want to hammer home, I'm a professor or an emeritus professor anyway, so repetition is part of our professional disease or professional deformation. This is about Islamism, which is an interpretation of the religion of Islam. It's not a very complicated point, but it is a crucial point. Islam and the Jews was not the product of Nazi propaganda. It was not because Husseini read Hitler or was told by the Nazis or paid by the Nazis to say it. It was his own indigenous cultural creation. But he was on the run from the British, and as you know, he fled to Iraq and then to Iran and then to Turkey and then to Italy, and he wound up in Berlin in November of 41. And I'm one of those professors who began before there was PowerPoint. So this is a translation of the text, a partial text of the famous essay. And this is one of the most famous photos of the Second World War. It is a photo of Haj Amin al-Husseini meeting with Hitler. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen this photo. It is November of 41. Husseini from 1941 to 45 was on the radio often, speaking in Arabic on Nazi transmitters, broadcast to Northern Africa, Egypt, Palestine, British Mandate Palestine. And what he did in those radio addresses was to elaborate on the themes of Islam and the Jews. So here he is in December of 1942 at the opening of the Islamic Institute in Berlin. The Quran says the Jews heat the cauldron of war and bring corruption on the earth, and God does not like those who corrupt. Such are their ways. They dominate America. They are behind atheistic communism. They have brought people against each other. The first enemies of the Muslims are today the Jews and the British and the Americans who support them. What is interesting about that short excerpt is that it echoes the themes of Nazi propaganda. And the core theme of Nazi propaganda regarding World War II and the Jews was that it was a Jewish war launched by the Jews who were in control of the Soviet Union and Britain, the United States, and the purpose of the war was to exterminate the German people. And therefore, in a heroic act of self-defense, the Nazi regime was going to exterminate the Jews instead. That was the paranoid construct, the core paranoid construct. Husseini was quite blunt, as Nazi propaganda in general was. In 1944, the Democratic and Republican parties both passed resolutions supporting a Jewish homeland in Palestine. The Defense Department and the Roosevelt White House was quite reserved about that. Nevertheless, Husseini was so furious that on the radio, he denounced the wicked American intentions toward the Arabs and called on listeners to rise as one, kill the Jews wherever you find them. This pleases God, history, and religion. Now, I want to save some time here. In my book, Israel's Moment, I worked a great deal on American politics in 1945, 46, 47, and we had a congressman in Brooklyn named Emanuel Seller, who is one of the great figures of American political history, and a senator named Robert Wagner, who was one of the senators who helped to build the welfare state and Social Security in the United States. And they were both urging Secretary of State George Marshall and President Truman to bring Husseini to trial. And it would not have been difficult, because the French army arrested him in May of 1945, and from May of 45 to June of 46, he was in French custody. And the French resisted efforts to indict him, bring him to Nuremberg, bring him to London. And this was a huge lost opportunity, in my view. A trial of Husseini in 1945-46 might have changed the history of this part of the world a great deal. But rather than face charges for war crimes or incitement to murder, Husseini was under comfortable house arrest outside Paris, so comfortable that he was able to put on a disguise and get on either it's the Pan Am or TWA flight from Paris to Cairo, and he received a hero's welcome in June of 1946. And the text of part of that welcome is on the screen, and it is from a man named Hassan al-Banna, the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood. The hearts of the Arabs palpitated with joy at hearing that the Mufti has succeeded in reaching an Arab country. And the key line is, this hero who challenged an empire and fought Zionism with the help of Hitler and Germany. Germany and Hitler are gone, but Amin al-Husseini will continue the struggle. He will continue the struggle. We historians of West Germany and East Germany and Europe after Nazism talk about the transition from the era of anti-fascism to that of the Cold War. And in both East and West, this transition from the anti-fascist unity of the Second World War to the Cold War made it possible for many former Nazi officials to escape reckoning by claiming in the East that they had always been sincere anti-fascists, and in the West that they had always been emphatic anti-communists. Haj Amin al-Husseini and the failure to bring him to account should be understood as part of that conservative era in the West of the Cold War. And this is important, that the reason that France wanted to get on the good side of Husseini, and French diplomats did want to get on the good side of Husseini, was in order to enhance, not undermine, but enhance the French colonial or post-colonial position in North Africa and in Lebanon. It was better to be on Husseini's good side than on the side of the Zionists. These realities are forgotten in decades of discussion that present Zionism as some form of colonialism. The Zionists, in fighting, as I'm telling you things you already know, in fighting against the British, were known at the time as an anti-colonial force, and even members of the Central Committee of the French Communist Party in 1946 and 47 extolled the Zionists along with the Vietnamese communists and others who were heroic strugglers against global imperialism. This era of the realities of those years is too often forgotten. I'm going to summarize my discussion of the PLO. This is a history that is very familiar to all of you. But the period of the PLO softened up the global left regarding the issue of terrorism waged against Israel. And the PLO, which had sincere and credible leftist credentials, thus helped to legitimate the language of anti-Zionism and to make the term Zionist toxic. in the Western academy, as if to be a Zionist was to be somehow a racist or a reactionary. That was a significant contribution by the intellectuals of the Palestine Liberation Organization and the diplomats at the United Nations, and many tenured professors in my country are indebted to their decades-long efforts. But it was in this climate of the legitimation of terror against the Jewish state that the Islamic resistance movement, or Hamas, wrote its founding charter in 1988. Now, when I speak about these issues in the United States, and even after October 7th, when I have spoken about these issues, I regularly ask audiences, that is, when it's safe enough to appear in person, if they have read the Hamas Charter. And a stunning number of people have not done so. It would be as if we were in 1942 and you were giving a talk about Nazism, and you would say, have you read Mein Kampf? And people would say, no, I haven't bothered to read it yet. It's indispensable. In 2008, someone at the Yale Law School, in the Avalon Project in Law, History, and Diplomacy, posted an English translation on its website. And there it is, the Hamas Covenant of August 1988. So at Yale Law School, one of the most famous law schools in the world, it was easy for anyone to read the Hamas Covenant. There's no substitute for reading the whole charter. I'm assuming that most of you have read it. But if you have not read it, at the end, sometime after this lecture, please go to your own computers and simply type in the Hamas Charter Avalon Project, and you can do so. In the name of the most merciful Allah, the martyr Imam Hassan al-Banna, the one who was so enthusiastic about Husseini's return, of blessed memory, that Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it. The Charter dispenses with the idea that this effort to obliterate Israel is not a form of antagonism to the Jews. It states, our struggle against the Jews is very great and very serious. It stresses its connections to the Muslim Brotherhood and declares that adopting Islam as its way of life, the movement goes back to the time of the birth of the Islamic message of the righteous ancestor, for Allah is its target, the Prophet is its example, and the Quran is its constitution. It presents itself as an interpretation of the religion of Islam and evokes the spirit of the 7th century. Its goal is to raise the banner of Allah over every other inch of Palestine, and by Palestine, it is referring to what is included, all of the state of Israel, including where we're standing. This, again, I repeat, the 1988 Charter is an interpretation of the religion of Islam. It is the labor of selective tradition. It is what Husseini did in 1937. It is taking a large tradition and it is interpreting it in a particular way. There is a great debate that will go on and on about whether there is something so inherent in Islam that contributes to this or not. It is the same debate that we historians of Europe have had about Christianity and Nazism. Without Christianity, there would not have been Nazism or the Holocaust. But Christianity alone did not produce the Holocaust. And in fact, Churchill and Roosevelt are also part of the Christian tradition. So the labor of selective tradition, the interpretation of these massive traditions, is something that is part of the toolkit of the intellectual and cultural historian, even if it doesn't easily translate into political and public discussion. So it presented, the Charter did, it presented the obliteration of the State of Israel as an Islamic, that is the first paragraph, as an Islamic religious obligation. The Prophet, Allah bless him and grant him salvation, has said the day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight the Jews, killing the Jews. When the Jew will hide behind the stones and trees, the stones and trees will say, O Muslims, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him. Again, that's the Charter. That's not an interpretation of the Charter. So it revealed the destruction of the State of Israel to be part of an apocalyptic murderous theodicy. and the killing of Jews was essential in order to bring about a redemptive apocalypse. And I'm convinced that this is exactly what Mr. Sinwar believes. Article 7 described Hamas as one of the links in the chain of struggle against the Zionist invaders of 1939, the War of 48, the jihad operations of the Muslim Brotherhood. It makes clear that every inch of Palestine is part of an Islamic waqf for property. So the first, 11 chapters, paragraphs of the charter are interpretations and expositions of the Islamic tradition, completely without any impact of European anti-Semitism or Nazi anti-Semitism. It is an indigenous cultural creation of Islamist ideologues. In discussions we can talk about gender issues, but its views of women, needless to say, are extremely conservative. Article 22 takes a turn. And here, instead of relying upon careful exposition of Islamic texts, this has nothing to do with Islamic texts. Meyer and Martin can correct me if I'm wrong. But this is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and Nazi propaganda turned that appears in Hamas charter. This is the classic conspiracy theory in which the Jews own the press, the finance. You will be interested to discover that we were behind the French Revolution, the communist revolutions, and revolutions all over the world. And that the Jews were the cause not only of World War I but also World War II. So that is classic European 20th century anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. What happened in Berlin between 1941 and 1945 was a cultural fusion. People from different cultures, from the Islamic world and then from the Nazi world, came together and they stimulated one another. They learned from one another. The Germans, the Nazis, learned that there was an Islamic tradition of Jew hatred that they had not been fully aware of to that extent. And the Islamists in Berlin learned that there were conspiracy theories that had not yet really been fully developed in the Islamic world. And out of this cauldron of 1941-45, emerged the Islamist tradition. Despite the fact that this document was readily available in English, the New York Times and the Washington Post never wrote a long interpretive essay about it. The readers of the New York Times and the Washington Post have not read a long interpretive essay which explains and presents the texts of the Hamas Charter. On January 5th, 1993, the Washington Post published 5 paragraphs from its 36 articles. The first mention of the charter in the New York Times appeared on April 16, 2009, in a very good 220-word letter to the editor by the late Israeli political theorist Shlomo Avineri on April 16th of 2009. In the years since, the Times has not published extensive sections of the charter. In 2003, in the aftermath of al-Qaeda's attacks of 9/11, a small left-leaning press in Freiburg, Germany, published my friend Matthias Kunzel's book, Jihad and Jew Hatred, I'm translating now into the English, on the new war against the Jews. And as far as I know, Matthias was the first extended public description of the charter, except for Meyer's, and its significance by any scholar in Israel, Europe, or the United States. He described the charter as probably the most important programmatic document of contemporary Islamism. Kunzel remained a minority. In 2010, Meyer Litvak published Martyrdom is Life, Jihad and Martyrdom and the Ideology of Hamas in the Specialist Journal of Studies in Conflict and Terrorism. Judging from published articles, this most important document of contemporary Islamism aroused little interest. Again, I know I'm beating very hard on the same point, but I want to make this point. Journalists, human rights organizations, scholars focused on the Middle East, scholars of Jewish and Israel studies, which is another subject, did not pay attention. In the vast effort of the war on terror, officials in the Bush and Obama administration did not draw attention to the Hamas Charter and the renewal of the war of religion, as Kunzel pointed out, against the Jews. The lack of attention in the academy to the Charter's Islamic dimension of Jew hatred and hatred of Israel found its counterpart in the paucity of attention in public discourse. And with the coming of the term Islamophobia, those, especially younger scholars, scholars without tenure, scholars looking for a job, those who examined the topic risked being accused themselves of Islamophobia, that is, of being racists. I've spoken for a while, and I want to summarize. In 2017, Hamas issued a statement from which the famous phrase, "from the river to the sea," comes, and it succeeded in its efforts to present this reactionary organization as a member of the global left. We can talk about that in a little more detail. A word about American campuses. The ideological origins of the attack on October 7th were long-standing, public, and they were too little noticed or examined. We historians of the Nazi era, as I pointed out a moment ago, refer to the problem of underestimation. Too few leaders and observers took Hitler's threats seriously enough, including his 1939 prophecy. The editors of the New York Times in 1941 wrote an editorial referring to Hitler's repetition of the prophecy as being so incredible that no one could really that Hitler was such a liar that no one could take seriously what he was threatening to do. The same inability to grasp the depth of fanaticism, lunacy, and hatred that greeted the Nazis in 1939 and 1940 in the government offices of London and the United States, perhaps except for Churchill and Roosevelt, that same inability to take seriously enough that these people really meant what they said constitutes this second era of underestimation. And given the massive historical scholarship on the first era of underestimation, this second era of underestimation is really inexcusable. There is a road, there is a historical context to October 7th, and it's not that of Rashid Khalidi's 100 Years War on Palestine. It is the road from Islam and the Jews in 1937 to the Hamas Charter of 1988 to the tunnel construction and the attack of October 7th. It is a long and winding road. There is sound evidence that Nazism had a role in this underexamined history. Yet October 7th took place 78 years after Nazi Germany was defeated. Scholars should be asking why the Jew hatred of the 1930s, 40s has been so persistent. Israel's adversaries, of course, have a ready answer. The hatred persists because Israel is so evil. The Jews or the Zionists are guilty. And today, I have pointed to another context, an additional causal factor, namely the Islamist interpretation of the religion of Islam that has been in the center of scholarly attention. As many of you will recall, Winston Churchill, in one of the volumes of his History of the Second World War, referred to the Second World War as the unnecessary war, a war that perhaps could have been prevented and deterred, saving not only the Jews of Europe, but many millions of other people. Well, had more historians, politicians, journalists, and policy experts drawn attention to the ideas I've described above and that other scholars in this room have examined in even greater detail, perhaps the Hamas dictatorship could have been isolated and overthrown many years ago. Or maybe even Hamas might not have come to power in the first place. Perhaps Anwar Sadat wouldn't have been assassinated so many years ago. It is in this historical context, the context of this long and winding path of a strange but powerful Islamist ideology, that should receive scholarly and public attention now and in the months to come. I conclude, again, by thanking for the honor of this invitation at this wonderful university in a room full of splendid scholars and fine colleagues. I have been fortunate to be part of your international scholarly community. And this scholarly community is going to survive and thrive, and it is not going to be destroyed. The situation for Jews in American university, and especially Jews like me, who made known their sympathies with this wonderful country, is difficult, and will continue to be so. When we historians of modern German history and the era of Nazism and the Holocaust retire, our lines often disappear to declining interest either in the discipline of history or the lines move to historians of the United States or other parts of the world. You can receive a degree in history from many prestigious universities in the United States without learning anything at all about the scholarship on anti-Semitism, Nazism, and the Holocaust. It will be a very hard time for young scholars who offer evidence of their Zionist sympathies in my country. An era of open discrimination against Jews who are suspected of the sin of Zionism is possible. And hiring Jews who make their disdain for Israel has already been a reality. There is no point in denying the reality of tenured anti-Semitism, that it is a reality of American universities. Yet there is some evidence that the anti-Zionist fanatical chants of freeing Palestine from the river to the sea, and Hamas, Hamas, we love you, we love your rockets too, kill another soldier now, a chant chanted on Broadway outside of Columbia University this spring. There is a chance that they have revealed to many other colleagues that yes, they really do have a problem with us Jews, that they know nothing about the history of Israel, that they are willing to be obnoxious, intolerant, bullying, and sometimes violent. And some of them reveal as well that they despise the United States too, because my country, thank goodness for Joe Biden, supports Israel. An optimistic note in these times is bad taste. That said, I want you to know that there is a small, quiet, pro-Israeli faculty in reaction that has begun, that expresses solidarity with you and other colleagues in Israel. We are a minority in the humanities and social sciences, but we will not be intimidated by the accusations of Islamophobia. As historians, we will fight together with our Israeli colleagues to bring the fruits of scholarship to our misinformed public and to those colleagues whose minds and hearts are still open to the evidence and argument of our historical interpretation. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you very much, Jeffrey, for this, I would say, fantastic and emotional lecture. I'm sure everyone was deeply touched by what you said. And I want to give now first the floor to another good friend, Meir Litvak. They of course know each other, correspondence a lot. We are all together in a list, sending ideas to each other. So I'll just present Meir. So Professor Meir Litvak is the director of the Alliance Center for the Iranian Studies at Tel Aviv University. Among his publications which are relevant to today's event is From Empathy to Denial, Arab Responses to Holocaust, co-authored with our late friend Esther Webman, which was also published in Hebrew by Magnus Press, and Know the Enemy, Attitudes Towards Other in Modern Shiite Iranian Thought and Practice, which was published by Brill in 2021.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to thank Jeffrey for his scholarly activity, public activity for world academia and for Israel. We've known each other for, I think, almost 20 years now. And I wrote an article in a book which he edited. So, now, of course, I agree with the big picture which Jeffrey spoke about. So I will focus my comments on a few tiny points. Now, Jeffrey spoke about the underestimation of ideology, and he raised various arguments or trying to explanations. I want to point to another possible argument, and here I'm referring, I think, to what, and Martin Kramer was, I think, the first one who noted it, and this is the legacy of Edward Said, and the impact of Edward Said on Western academic circles. That it has become problematic to write critical articles on radical Islam, on Islamic society, Islamic movements, because the moment you write anything radical about anything critical about radical Islam, you're accused of being again Islamophobic or pro-colonialist, etc. And this has certainly had a major impact on scholarship and academic world in the West. Another problem, or maybe another reason, is the legacy of Foucault. Again, who taught academics or impacted academics that every ideology is not real ideology. People don't really believe in the nonsense of what they say. It is really a mask of power, or the grabbing power. And therefore, you should not take ideology seriously, because these people don't really mean what they say. It's only what Hamas really wants is only power. They don't really care about the ideology. And by the way, some Israeli scholars also fell into this trap. Now, Foucault, for instance, was one of the scholars who, during the 1978 revolution or 1979 revolution in Iran, went to Iran and was thrilled and enthusiastic about the Iran revolution, which he saw as, again, as a major liberating force against Western imperialism, against academic oppression, Western academic oppression, etc. Although, to his credit, years later, he regretted his thrill from the Iran Revolution. So this would be another, I think, to add to what Jeffrey said. Now, there's also another problem, which I would say, is that in Western academia, again, most academics are liberals or leftists, or they're secular people. I think they have great difficulty in truly understanding religious people, religious ideologies, that people take seriously religious beliefs and religious ideologies. And to give you an example, take a person like John Brennan, who was the National Security Advisor in the Obama administration, a former CIA officer who said in the year 2012, or 2011, sorry, during the highlight of the so-called Arab Spring, he spoke about the Muslim Brothers, and he said two things about the Muslim Brothers. One is that the Muslim Brothers is indeed genuinely a democratic organization, and secondly, that they're really secular organization. Now, you can forgive him for naivety when he believed that the Muslim Brothers were democratic. But for a person who is a national security advisor to describe the Muslim Brothers as secular is either total ignorance or something much worse. And I think this is the problem that, again, plagues many circles in Western academics, Western academia, that the failure to understand, again, the genuine belief of religious radicals, that they genuinely believe in what they say and take them therefore seriously. Now, Jeffrey also spoke about this anti-Zionism of the in Western academia. I would say that at least in some cases, this anti-Zionism serves as a facade or mask for deeply latent anti-Semitism. That people who were ashamed to be anti-Semites in the past could now be more openly anti-Semites. And let me give an example from last week. There was a debate in Columbia University about the grievances of Jewish students. And we had 3 deans who were responsible for this, taking of one of them student deans in Columbia University, passing messages among themselves, ridiculing those Jews. They probably wanted to raise these arguments about anti-Semitism because they want to get money, which is again the typical anti-Semitic trope of the greedy Jews. Again, raised by people who usually declare themselves as open liberals or leftists. And maybe I would also add that this may be another, again, element for the tendency of the left to exonerate Hamas. Now, I want to move to another point, the Islamist point. Now, Jeffrey brought Hajj Amin al-Husseini's letter from 1937. But I would say that Husseini framed the conflict with Zionism as a religious conflict much earlier than 1937. In fact, from the early 1920s, Husseini framed the conflict as a religious one. You can look at it as a fatwa ruling against selling land to the Jews, and certainly from 1928 to 1929, the slogan or the theme that the Jews threaten Al-Aqsa Mosque. That the Jews want to destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque and they threaten Al-Aqsa Mosque. It became a mobilizing slogan in the Palestinian national movement since then to the present. Now, we have, I think if you look at the British Mandate period, not only Husseini, but many other Palestinians, of course, did not distinguish between Jews and Zionism, did not distinguish between nationalism and religion. Palestinian nationalism was influenced very much by nationalism, and don't take my testimony. Musa Bouderi, a Palestinian scholar, in his article about Palestinian nationalism, speaks about the fusion of Islam and Palestinian nationalism. Okay? It goes, I mean, it's not only Husseini, it is something deeper, goes back to, again, the early 20s. So speaking about and what Husseini did was not much different, again, was not something new. And this is what I want to argue. Now, Husseini's argument in 1937 were not much different in most of its aspects than traditional polemics against Jews being against the Prophet Muhammad, Jews trying to mislead the Prophet Muhammad, betray the Prophet Muhammad, etc. And this has been themes in Muslim polemics against Judaism going back for centuries. I think the new element, which is in Husseini's argument, which then became a typical argument in modern Islamist anti-Semitism, which is different from traditional anti-Judaism, is the description of the Jews as active enemies who want to destroy Islam. It is not simply the Jews who distort the true scriptures that Moses gave them. It is not the Jews who refuse to recognize the Prophet Muhammad. It is the Jews as enemies who actively try to destroy Islam, has been active enemies of Islam from its earliest time to the present. This is a modern theme, and I think this would be, Husseini would be one of the contributors to this modern theme. Now, here, by the way, I would say that Husseini's opposition to Jewish sovereignty, or to say that Husseini that this Islamism played a key role, is in rejecting Zionism, is not necessarily issue of modern Islamism. I think this is an element that is deeply rooted in Islamic tradition, because according to Islamic tradition, Jews have been punished by God because they rejected the message of the Prophet Muhammad. They have been carrying the wrath of God upon them, what is in the Quran, which says the Al-Maghdub alayhim in the Surah Al-Fatiha. And the Jews have been destined by God to be dispersed among the nations and humiliated by the nations. Therefore, the idea of Jewish sovereignty is an affront and challenge against Islam, even before Husseini or including Husseini and after Husseini. That is, this is something that is deeply rooted, I would say, in Islamic traditions, regardless of Islamism. Okay. I want to say, by the way, that Arab leaders did not need Husseini to reject Zionism. The rejection of Zionism was universal among most Arab leaders, except with the exception of Emir Abdullah of Jordan. All of them were opposed to Zionism, because for them Zionism, again, is not only the issue of Judaism against Islam, but Zionism is a form of modern colonialism. Now, one more point here. Jeffrey spoke a lot about the Hamas Charter. Here, let me say, I'm sure that Hamas Charter was translated to English long before the Avalon Project. It was probably also translated in Israel as well to English. Certainly here, the Dayan Center, I think one of the earliest publications of the Hamas Charter. But what I want to say is that Hamas Charter, as horrible as it is merely a drop in the bucket of a much broader, larger Islamist anti-Semitic literature, including by Hamas. Hamas has been an extremely prolific organization in establishing anti-Semitic themes, not only in the charter, but in booklets, articles, in the websites, in the social media. I mean, this is a major industry, and the charter is merely one element. Not even, by the way, the worst one among them. Let me say one thing. Hamas had in the past a very useful website called the Palestine Info, in which they liberated their ideology in Arabic and 27 other languages. Now, when I worked on Hamas in the past, I worked on the Arabic website, and I once looked at the English website. And these are two different movements. The Hamas in English website is a moderate liberal movement that only wants freedom and other good things that every good intentioned person in the world would wish. I had a student who came to Israel from Russia, and she read the Russian version of the same website, and she told me that compared to the Russian version, the Arabic version, which was thoroughly anti-Semitic, was extremely benign. That is, the Russian version was much worse than the Arabic version. Now, here I would add, again, another point. Jeffrey mentioned correctly, or in his written article, the 2017 Hamas document, in which they tried to, in a way, a little bit, or I would say for public consumption, to retreat from their overt or openly anti-Semitic statements, saying they're only not against Jews, they're only against Zionists, etc. Some people bought it. By the way, here the Western media immediately quoted this document, and including some people in Israel. But one only had to listen to what Hamas preachers used to say in Hamas sermons on Friday, which were broadcast on Hamas TV every Friday, to see that the document was really for foreign consumption, never for internal consumption. In the TV sermons, they spoke time and again about the need to exterminate the Jews and etc. And here I would say that unlike the Nazis, Hamas did not use euphemisms in their talks about what they want to do to the Jews. If the Nazis in some of the external correspondence used euphemisms such as the final solution or resettlement in the East or special treatment, etc., Hamas doesn't speak in such euphemisms. Hamas, in many of its documents, spoke openly and bluntly about the need to exterminate the Jews. Now, and of course, this is nothing new to those who deal with modern Islamism. And the disturbing question, of course, is the blindness of Western academic circles to this issue, but this Jeffrey spoke a lot about, so I don't have nothing more to say. Thank you very much.
So, thank you very much, Meir. I'll open the floor for your questions. Yes, just one question of mine. I want to ask you, you didn't mention the fact that during the 60s, 70s, 80s, Islamism was not so dominant among the Palestinians, terrorist groups. But more left, they were more on the left. So I think that there is need an explanation what happened. what happened with the message of Husseini, which Husseini was not such a maybe I'm not sure, but I think that he wasn't so well known. Maybe I'm wrong. Anyhow, he wasn't somewhat dominant figure in these groups. We were on the left, even communist groups, but on the left, and you wrote your fantastic book about East Germany and how they helped these terrorist organizations. So I think there is a need to explain what happened during those decades, what happened to the Islamist ideology. And also I would ask, to what extent do you think that we contributed, to the fact that Islamism became so strong among the Palestinians, or maybe we don't have anything to do with it?
The answer to your question is one that I would rather ask Meyer or Martin Kramer to address. There are I would just say two things very. Is this microphone working? Yes. Yes. I would just say two things very briefly, and again, I defer to Meyer. And that is a historian's question of how secular was the Palestine Liberation Organization. How secular a figure was Yasser Arafat, really? To the world, to the Europe and American world, to the world of the United Nations, he was the Arabic Che Guevara, the secular leftist par excellence, who could speak the language of Marxism-Leninism. So my questions to you in that regard. My understanding is that Islamism resurged in the wake of the defeat of 1967, the Arab defeat of 1967, and then the frustrations of the failure to destroy Israel in 1973, and very importantly, the Iranian Revolution. The existence of the Islamic Republic of Iran was the first time since Nazi Germany, and here again, Meyer and Martin could discuss this in more detail, the first time that there was a government in the world that inscribed hatred of the Jews as part of its core ideology, and that it was a significant government with a large population and oil resources. And so Iran and the Islamic Republic of Iran and the revolution of 1979 should be a major figure, a major factor in the rise of Islamism. So those are, and in regard to Israel's responsibility, here I'm not an expert on the details of, but in New York 2 months ago, I had the great privilege of being at a dinner with Ehud Barak, who, if you think I was passionate here, you should have heard Barak about how he wants people in the streets and a new election as soon as possible to get rid of this horrible Netanyahu government. And it was quite something to listen to Israel's most decorated military soldier speaking in those terms. But he, of course, as you know, made an offer that the Palestinians rejected. So if you ask me as somewhat of a layperson now in regard to the history of Israeli, Palestinian, Arab diplomacy, I would repeat Avi Eben's famous phrase that the Palestinians never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And but again, I say that as somewhat of a layperson in this regard. But what do you think about this mixture of secularism and religiosity in the PLO?
I'll try to answer briefly. Islamism, and again, a lot has been written about. Martin wrote about it a lot. Islamism rose from the 1967 outcome of '67 war, the failure of Pan-Arabism, failure of Arab socialism, the Arab social crisis, etc., the impact of the Iran Revolution. Also, I would say disappointment from the PLO. The PLO did not deliver. in the 1970s. Palestinians were frustrated that Arafat, what is we used to call is the la'am policy, a yes and no policy, which not deliver maybe UN resolutions, but nothing for the Palestinians. And also, I would say the ill-fated Israeli invasion to Lebanon. We defeated the PLO, but we suffered the defeat of Hezbollah. The conclusion was you fight Israel in secular terms, you lose. You fight Israel with Islam, you succeed. Plus the economic situation, social economic situation in the West Bank, in Gaza. Now, the role of Israel. There is a myth that Arafat invented and people in Israel accepted it, and the people that Israel created Hamas and so on. This is nonsense. I also say that argument that Israel created Hamas is a racist argument because it deprives the Palestinians of any agency and it makes them look as like little children, that everything is done for them by Israel. It is true that Israel failed to understand the danger of Islamism in the 1980s. In the 1980s, the Muslim brothers in Gaza were not engaged in terrorism, they were engaged in social activity. Israel in the early 1980s should have understood that it should become a radical phenomenon because we had the assassination of Sadat and the revolution. This Israel failed to understand. That is, Israel could have tried or should have tried to suppress Muslim brothers in Gaza. It did not, but it did not create Hamas. This was not Hamas yet. What Israel did later, okay, here, especially Netanyahu government, when Netanyahu and Smotrich said that Hamas is an asset to Israel after it seized power in Gaza, this is a different story. But to say that Israel created Hamas or Israel could have prevented Hamas from rising, I think is not true. Now, regarding the Islam and PLO and Fatah in Islam, Fatah is an organization that regards Islam as an element of Palestinian culture. It borrows themes from Islam, such as the name Fatah itself, by the way, has Islamic connotation. Fatah used terms like martyrdom, jihad, etc. But Fatah was not an Islamist organization because Fatah never wanted, and still does not want, for instance, to establish Sharia rule. Okay? The last thing they want is to have Islamic Sharia rule in the West Bank, also when they ruled Gaza. In this regard, they are different from Hamas, which is an Islamist organization. Fatah is an organization that uses religion as a source of mobilization, as a cultural element of Palestinian nationalism. But it's not a religious organization as per se. Now, one more point, by the way, with all due respect to the Palestinian left, it was never very powerful. It was best organized, it had best intellectuals. Politically, it may have been more advanced, or they saw things earlier than Fatah. But they never had much popular support, partly because they were Marxist and not religious. And therefore, they had more support in universities than in the streets.
Okay.
So if we can go back and forth just for a bit. I think that that my talk and your talk raised the following issue, which is I was accentuating the history of something called Islamism that was an interpretation of the religion of Islam. And if I heard you correctly, I think you were suggesting that I was not naive, but that I was underestimating the extent to which the traditions of Islam persisted in the Islamist tradition, which is a politically significant issue, because the Abraham Accords and the rapprochement or attempted rapprochement with Saudi Arabia and all that rests to some extent on the idea that there is an Islam that wants to coexist with Israel. All right. So
no, I think there should be a clear distinction between Islamism as an ideology, as a movement, and Islam as a religion, because Islam, as you mentioned, people who know religion, Islam contains many things, many elements, sometimes contradictory, etc. The question is what you choose from it, what you select, how you interpret it, and how you apply it. Now, Jews for Islam were not a major issue. They were a minority. Islam was not obsessed with Judaism, and I think, again, Martin wrote about it long before I did. Islam was never obsessed with Judaism the way Christianity was obsessed with Judaism in the medieval period. And therefore, anti-Judaism never had the same central place in Islamic tradition as it had in Christian tradition. There were anti-Jewish themes. I'm not trying to deny, but it was never as central. anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism is central, if not the central, it is a central element in principle of the ideology of Islamism. And anti-Semitism is much more one-dimensional element theme in modern Islamism. And of course, the idea of genocide is an essential element of modern Islamism, which does not exist in traditional Islam. So here I would make a clear distinction.
Dr. Kramer, please.
First, thank you, Jeffrey, both for your solidarity and for your courage. These past few years, it's no easy thing to be Jeffrey Herf in America.
Oh, Martin Kramer too. We have tenure.
Yeah. But I don't have to walk onto a campus every day where I'm assault my senses and sense of morality are assaulted on a daily basis. So congratulations for holding the fort.
Thank you.
Just a few quick observations. When you talked about the charter, I didn't know that anyone had actually looked into the extent to which the charter had been taken seriously by the mainstream media. The same thing happened, by the way, with Khomeini's book, Islamic Government. Bernard Lewis writes about how this text was circulating among some academics. They tried to bring it to the attention of the New York Times and the Washington Post, which suspected that it might be a fabrication, and therefore were prepared to run with it. Finally, it received a mention. This is a recurring pattern, a denial of the nature of the narrative that you find among Islamists. So it's nothing new. By the way, Lewis, if I'm already mentioning him, it's been said that I've written about this, I've written about that. I just took it all from Bernard Lewis. I mean, it's all in Semites and anti-Semites. This book. Lewis, by the way, was quite persuaded that it was a modern influence coming out of Nazi Germany, because he spent World War II in British intelligence, where his job was to trace the impact of German Nazi incitement on the Arabs. And so he had chapter and verse on that. And I wrote a piece about Lewis and this, I think in the upcoming issue of Studies in Anti-Semitism in October. So only in World War II does you get the real full transcendence of the traditional bigotry to something new, although there is a pre-evolution. And I think something that's missing maybe in the discussion of the pre-evolution is Husseini's 1931 Pan-Islamic Congress in Jerusalem. Because what does that Congress say? It says the struggle against global Jewry has to be undertaken by the global Islamic community. And that's a sort of pre-evolution to this notion. I want to talk about our underestimations for a moment. Now, we didn't underestimate the intentions. And as Mayor indicated, it's been done here in the Dayan Center, or Shlomo Amineri was taking from things which were done here. Look at memory. The whole project of memory has been to bring all this to light, and they've been doing it for years. So where did we go wrong? It's not that we underestimated the intentions, we underestimated the capabilities. So Hamas is not, like Nazi Germany, preeminent industrial power on the world's most developed continent. Even though they told ourselves, even though they want to kill us, we know that they are incapable of doing it. And to some extent that was true. I mean, in the end, the Aqsa flood lasted a day on the offensive. So it was not the Anschluss, it was not Sudetenland, it was not the invasion of Poland, it was not Dunkirk, 1,200 dead. You know, it was a very slow day of Jew killing in the fall of 1942. But nonetheless, we did underestimate their capabilities, and that really is our contribution to what happened on October 7th. The last point I want to make, and it was prompted by something that Mayor said about Edward Said. And you're right, we do live in an environment in which criticism of things Islamic is considered to be open Orientalism, which is defined as anti-Semitism against Arabs. But Said, when he talks specifically about Hamas, had some very caustic things to say. And this I call the Said paradox. Let me just quote two things that he himself said. As for, this is in 1994, Edward Said on Hamas, he said, as to Hamas and its actions in the occupied territories, I know that the organization is one of the only ones expressing resistance. Yet for any secular intellectual to make a devil's pact with a religious movement is, I think, to substitute convenience for principle. It is simply the other side of the pact we made during the past several decades with dictatorship and nationalism, for example, supporting Saddam Hussein when he went to war with the Persians. So here you have him taking a step, as a secular intellectual, taking a step back from religious movement. And then here's this criticism he made of Arafat in 2002. Arafat, never really reined in Hamas and Islamic Jihad, which suited Israel perfectly, so that it would have a ready-made excuse to use the so-called martyrs, mindless suicide bombings, to further diminish and punish the whole people. So he used Arafat's refusal to crack down on Hamas and the suicide bombings of Hamas as a vector to criticize the Palestinian Authority. The interesting thing that happened after October 11th was the same secular intellectuals who claimed to be the followers of Edward Said began to trumpet Hamas as resistance. And the difference is that in Edward Said's day, they weren't able to kill very many Jews. And on October 7th, they managed to kill a lot of Jews. And so any reservations about the nature of the resistance were set aside because Hamas had finally become an effective Jew-killing machine.
That is the crux of what I was getting at. That the shocking thing, the word shocking is out of my vocabulary. The aspect I was emphasizing before, but especially since October 7th, is that the intellectuals and the journalists who regard themselves as liberals, or some of them leftists, would not criticize Hamas, would not denounce Hamas. Some of them wouldn't even use the word Hamas, they would refer to the Palestinians. And so the question is, why does this world that regards itself as Edward Said described, I hadn't read that for a long time, as secular, liberal, leftist, modern, men and women are equal, gays are fine, the world is, is God there? I don't know, but if he is, that's fine. If he isn't, that's fine. Whatever. We're modern people. We don't want to have anything to do with people who are so certain that God is running the world. Who knows? And certainly we don't want to kill anybody because of that. And yet that whole world of modern ironic sensibility since October 7th could not find the words to denounce this reactionary organization. And that is something that intellectual and cultural historians of the West are going to be struggling with. My wife and I, when we were young scholars, were at the bottom of the totem pole in Harvard University as lecturers. And one of the benefits of that is to have splendid students. And one of my most splendid students is Anthony Blinken. And Tony is the only figure I can recall now since October 7th in world politics outside of Israel who has had the temerity to insist that people put the responsibility on Hamas for launching and continuing this war. The only one. Not Olaf Scholz, not Mr. Sinek, not Macron. No one else. And many in Washington, they won't say this war would end if Hamas would simply surrender. It started a criminal war. There are a bunch of criminals. They should stop this war. And so the Blinken exception underscores the point you made so clearly. It is, and I would add one more thing, and that is that these ideas are tenured in American universities. And the people who have them are between the ages of 40 and 60. And they're going to be there for a while. In regard to what you said about, I think you made a few comments about sovereignty. And I'm a historian of Nazism and the Holocaust. I mean, that's among the things that I've done. And what we've done to understand how the Holocaust happened, why it happened, how it happened, the intentions and the capabilities. There is a massive library all over the world in many languages. There's almost nothing we don't understand about the Holocaust. The Holocaust is not incomprehensible. It's comprehensible. We used to think that the more that the world knew about the Holocaust, the more favorable it would be towards the Jewish state, towards Israel. But there's something not, I wouldn't use the word comforting. That's not right. But there's something normal about the Holocaust in Western history, and that is the Jews are the victims. The extremity of the victimhood is greater than previously. But the Zionist revolution was a turning point in the history of the West, that the Jews had taken matters into their own hands. And that was not something that Islam or the Islamists were able to accept. And there's something about it also that is discomforting in the Christian world. And that is that the murderous Jew who killed Jesus, supposedly, is now the aggressive colonial imperialist Zionist. And there's something about that nightmare, that deep Christian nightmare, that came to fruition when the Jews took matters into their own hands, and it became dangerous to attempt to kill Jews. And that the sovereignty, the existence of sovereignty here, in view of these both major religious traditions, I think is a major reason why this country of 7 million people obsesses the United Nations for the last 70 years, given all the other terrible things that go on in the world. That, in that sense, there is a connection between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, because the order of things changed when the Jews had sovereignty. They were no longer, let me put it this way. In the United States, I think it's much easier for high school students to empathize with Anne Frank than with David Ben-Gurion.
Can I?
אתה רוצה לענות עכשיו?
Okay. Very, very briefly, 3 points. About Edward Said and the intellectuals. Said was an Arab, and I think he understood how dangerous Hamas was for Arabs. As much as he was living in New York, he was still enough part of the Arab world to understand that what damage Hamas could do to the Arabs. Those intellectuals in America don't understand really what happens in the Arab world, and they don't understand the damage that Islamists and Hamas did to Arab people. Something similar, I think, of Western intellectuals in the 1960s who had great admiration for Mao Zedong and the Great Cultural Revolution. They didn't understand the suffering of the Chinese people. But it is very uncomfortable to be in uptown Manhattan and glorify the revolutionaries in China. I think there's something similar here. Also, I would say that something that brings together people, and I didn't mention it in my talk, why do people like Judith Butler support Hamas? I think because they both share animosity toward the Enlightenment, to liberalism. Both regard liberalism and the Enlightenment as the greatest evil, and they therefore sympathize with each other. And finally, the link of anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, also in Christianity. We should recall the caricature in the Italian newspaper in 2002, when during the Israeli counterattack on the West Bank, Chomat Magen, a caricature showing little Jesus wearing kafia with the same way of the Jewish boy from the Warsaw Ghetto, surrounded by Israeli soldiers and saying, please don't crucify me again. This is the epitome of anti-Semitism, the Jew is a Nazi, and again, the Jews crucify Jesus once again. And I think this shows the link between, again, latent Christian anti-Semitism and modern anti-Zionism.
Thank you. I think that was a fascinating triangle that followed a fascinating lecture. I'd like to add 2 comments. One is, Jeffrey, you remember the Zoom that we shared, in which this question of reading the Hamas covenant was part of. You said that your estimation is that most of the people in the room have read the Hamas covenant. I wouldn't vouch for that. I don't know. And I think most, or let's say the other way around, those who did read it, who are in a minority, are a minority. This is a threatening text. You ask yourself, okay, from which age do you teach this text? Do you teach in high school? When is it that you reveal the full scale, the full scope of the wish around us to outdo the state we're living in? I'd like to mention in this connection that the Israeli Ministry of Education forbids translating Mein Kampf and forbids translating the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Both were never translated in full into Hebrew. Because, well, the argument is that such foul and vile texts cannot be translated into Hebrew, the language, okay? But I think it's the same, it goes along the same line. They were not translated. The Hamas covenant was translated long ago. You could read it. But it is not taught, it is not read, it's a threat. You want to live optimistically, and so you don't swallow that. One small, well, it's not that small, regarding Durban. I was part of our foreign ministry delegation to Durban, and it was quite an experience. Some 2-3 days, the whole conference went for 8 days. On the third day, it was already clear that it has taken an anti-Israeli, anti-Jewish together, anti-Israeli, anti-Jewish turn, and the demonstrations, the material, the shoutings in the corridors, it was horrible. And then I went up to the chairman of the plenary, he was a Belgian, and said, listen, can you explain to me what's going on? This conference, there was so much money was put in preparations. Budgets were allocated. There were 4 preparatory conferences before. The idea was to struggle against racism that was plaguing Europe with the coming of immigrants. What does Israel have to do with this? And he looked at me. He didn't say Meidele because he didn't know Yiddish, but he looked at me as a Meidele, and he said, very simply, if dealing with racism means that racism is admitted, and if it's admitted, then it demands reparations, okay? Then it means that Belgium has to compensate Congo for what it has taken from it. Portugal should compensate Brazil. Spain would give back Peru the gold that was taken, etc., etc. We will all be bankrupt in a week. So the easiest solution ever is to pick on Israel and the Jews. That's it. And he said it outright. A formal person holding a formal position.
Starting with David Jonah Goldhagen, he poses that the cause of the evil is the Christian definition of heretics and sinners, and this is but this does not contain a biologist element. Now I have a question. In the Muslim world, did the Soviet period, that is the Soviet José Hudabiye, so to speak, to quote Rafael Israeli, that is did this period leave some kind of an element of pseudo or bastard biologist dimension in the cult of man that did allow actually also Islam to be contaminated, which I think that Goldhagen did not touch upon, contaminated with a bastard Darwinian definition of nationhood, of German nationhood, for the purpose of unification.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the question. Yes, no, thank you.
Should we, you want to take another?
No, another question. Thank you. The question is clear.
Thank you. Thank you for the lecture. My question is very precise. Several people mentioned the United Nations and different countries. I would like you to connect the issue of anti-Zionism with geopolitics, because it seems that Iranian leaders, Russian leaders, they have a very clear idea about how useful is anti-Zionism, while in the United States or other Western democracies still are trying to understand what this is about. Thank you.
The contribution, in my view, that the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc and the Western radical left made to the history of anti-Semitism was that it made it intellectually respectable. The problem with Husseini and other Islamists in the 1940s and 1950s in world politics was that their affiliation with the Nazi regime was well known by people active at the United Nations and in governments. So it was still in a period in which Nazism was beyond the pale, the definition of evil. And to the extent that anti-Semitism or hostility to Israel was associated with Nazism, it was intellectually disrespectable. And in 3 Phases of Anti-Semitism, I included a chapter on Nazi anti-Zionism. The Nazis were very profoundly anti-Zionist. But what happened in the Soviet Union in the course of the anti-cosmopolitan purges in the 1950s was that anti-fascism was redefined, and that Israel was, the Soviet Union, as you know, played a significant role in 1947-48, and Czechoslovakia in facilitating and aiding the creation of the Jewish state. When the United States and Britain were imposing an arms embargo, Czechoslovakia was sending the arms, for which Ben-Gurion was very grateful. But then after, for geopolitical reasons, Stalin understood that it became clear that David Ben-Gurion was not a communist sympathizer, that the state of Israel was not going to be a tool of Soviet influence. At that point, the Soviet Union made the calculation that there were many more Arabs than Jews, that the presence of oil and control over the oil could undermine the Western alliance in Western Europe, and that for geopolitical reasons, it made sense to turn sides and support the Arabs. The Isabella Tabarovsky, who I don't know if she lives in Jerusalem now, but Isabella grew up in the Soviet Union and now is toggles between Israel and Washington, D.C., has written a number of fine articles about Soviet anti-Semitism and Soviet anti-Zionism and the intersection of the two. And I think your question raises an issue of historical methodology. And we historians of politics and culture and ideology know that, or believe and that the evidence supports us, that people can hold 2 ideas in their heads at the same time. That is that Hitler, for example, was convinced that anti-Semitism would be an effective tool for undermining the American war effort. And so to the extent that he could convince American citizens that Franklin Roosevelt was a tool of Felix Frankfurter and Herbert Lehman, and that this was a Jewish war, and that the boys from Iowa were going to be going to Europe to be there to save the Jews, to that extent that the war was defined as a Jewish war, that it would undermine support in the United States, fracture the American polity, and prevent American intervention, or weaken intervention. So hence, anti-Semitism is a tool, right? The geopolitical instrument in the toolkit of the German foreign ministry. Cynical, but let's use it as a tool. At the same time that Hitler and Ribbentrop could view anti-Semitism as a clever tool to undermine the American war effort, Hitler and Goebbels and Himmler fanatically believed that there was an international Jewish conspiracy that was attempting to exterminate the German people. It was an article of faith. They believed it deeply. And so it's possible for people to be both cynics and ideologues at the same time. And I think that was true of the Soviet leadership as well. And there are other, Isabella's not here, but other people can speak more about the roots of certainly the Soviet propaganda against. When the Soviet ambassador to the United States, to the United Nations in 1967, I forget his name,
Fedorenko.
Turned to the Israelis and said, "Keep your big nose out of the business of the Middle East." So the cynicism and the Jew hatred fused. It wasn't one or the other. And that's a methodological drawback of some national security studies that Meyer was referring to when he was talking about Mr. Brennan. That if you're trained as a political scientist, you know about deterrence theory and international politics is about, the world that Thucydides understood, and ideas are, they're not so different from Foucault in that regard, that ideas are rationale for power interests. You find it difficult to take seriously the beliefs of people who are so different. There's a lot about Hannah Arendt's origins of totalitarianism that leaves a lot to be desired from the perspective of a historian. She was long on opinions and sometimes short on fact. But there is one thing that her greatness, and she was wrong about Eichmann completely, but her greatness also lay in being that independent spirit in New York in the 1940s who said, you know what, Franz Neumann, when Hitler and Goebbels say that the earth is flat and the Jews are causing this war, they believe it.
Mm-hmm.
They believe it. It's not just a tool. They really believe it. And you've read too much Marx and too much Machiavelli and too much Hobbes. You need to just step back a bit, maybe think a little bit more about the power of
the irrational world.
Yeah. So she got that right. But sorry for the long soliloquy, but here. But
there was a question.
Yeah.
You asked also something, no? Okay. So, other questions? More questions? Okay, so
You can believe
I will.
irrational ideology,
Yeah.
but perform it and carries out rationally.
Well, the thing here, I'll elaborate then. It's not enough to say that the earth is flat or that the Jews run the world. That is insufficient. It's not enough to publish Mein Kampf and say all the ridiculous things that Hitler said. What the Nazis also did was to interpret the Second World War on a day-to-day basis. Why is this event happening? Why is that event happening? And anti-Semitism and Jew hatred was an interpretation of events. It was an interpretation of events. Why? Here is the central riddle of the Second World War. On the one hand, they're the communists. They hate capitalism. They hate the bourgeoisie. And on the other hand, there's Wall Street and there's capitalism. And look what's happening in 1941. Look, the capitalists and the communists are in the same alliance. This is ridiculous. Why are the capitalists and the communists agreeing with one another? Aha! We have the answer. Because the Jews are working behind the scenes in Moscow, London, and Washington. And they have formed this alliance. And day after day after day, the Nazi press and radio hammered away on an anti-Semitic interpretation of events. It was potent.
Okay, so with this not so happy note, we'll complete the session. And thank you very much, Jeffrey, and thank you very much, Mo. It was fascinating. Thank you very much.